The small village of Little Hemsby lay nestled between rolling Dorset hills, its thatched cottages dusted with frost, and the scent of burning logs drifting from every chimney. December had descended upon the countryside with a quiet, dignified hush, and the villagers were bustling about in preparation for the annual winter FT at Thornbury Manor. Miss Jane Marple, who had travelled from St. Mary Mead to visit an old friend, found herself observing the festive stir with her usual keen eye. The manor itself was a grand, ivy-clad building with tall mullioned windows and a turreted roof. A soft golden glow spilled from the windows, promising warmth and the scent of roasted chestnuts and spiced mulled wine. Miss Marple had been invited by Lady Agatha Thornbury, a charming but rather formal widow, known throughout Dorset for her impeccable manners and love of social gatherings. Miss Marple, in her usual understated attire, a woolen grey coat, sensible hat, and knitting tucked under her arm, found herself welcomed with gentle warmth. She had always enjoyed these country FTs, not merely for the tea and cakes, but for the human stories that seemed to unfurl themselves as naturally as ivy on the manor walls. Among the guests were Lady Agatha's nephew, Richard Thornbury, a sharply dressed young man with an air of impatience, his fiancée, Caroline Devine, whose smile seemed a little too rehearsed for a genuine moment of joy, the manor's long-time housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, a woman of formidable presence and whispered gossip, Reverend Charles Bellamy, a kindly clergyman with a sharp mind for parish matters, and Dr. Lionel Hargrave, the village physician, whose calm demeanour concealed a restless curiosity. Miss Marple had barely settled into the drawing-room when the first tremor of unease rippled through the evening. The guests had gathered in the great hall, beneath the glittering chandelier, to sip mulled wine and admire the festively decorated tree. The atmosphere was cheerful yet, as Miss Marple observed, subtle undercurrents of tension whispered among the assembled company. Richard and Caroline's whispered arguments in the corner, Lady Agatha's nervous glances at her late husband's portrait, and Mrs. Pritchard's brisk movements hinted at hidden grievances. It was during the toast to the FT's success, with the full moon casting a silver light through the mullioned windows, that the incident occurred. A shrill cry pierced the festive hum, and the guests turned to find Lady Agatha collapsed on the Persian rug. Miss Marple, who had been knitting quietly by the fireplace, was immediately at her side. Lady Agatha was conscious but visibly shaken, and the telltale signs of poisoning, a sudden pallor, a faint sheen on her lips, were evident. Someone must fetch Dr. Hargrave! Miss Marple exclaimed, her voice calm but firm. Within moments, the doctor was attending to Lady Agatha, checking her pulse and observing her symptoms with professional care. It seems, he began, only to be interrupted by Lady Agatha herself, who, with a feeble but determined whisper, said, "It was the mulled wine, I only took a sip." The room fell into a hush. A poison in the mulled wine. The very thought sent a shiver through the assembled guests. Miss Marple's sharp mind immediately began to catalogue the possibilities. Who could have had access to the wine, and with what motive? The FT, meant to be a simple celebration, had become the setting for a chilling crime, or at the very least, a terrifying attempt. As Lady Agatha was helped to a nearby armchair, Miss Marple surveyed the scene with quiet intensity. The wine glasses still glimmered with the reflection of the chandelier, and the tray from which they had been served lay innocently on a side table. Yet, the meticulous order of Thornbury Manor had been subtly disrupted. She noted the positioning of the guests, their expressions, Caroline's feigned concern, Richard's sudden defensiveness, Mrs. Pritchard's tightly pressed lips, and Reverend Bellamy's composed, but slightly twitching fingers. It was an incident that demanded careful observation rather than immediate accusation. Miss Marple, in her experience, knew that true understanding of a crime came not from panic, but from patience, from watching the human heart reveal itself in small, telling gestures. And in the quiet shadow of the Mulled Wine Moon, she resolved to uncover the truth. For, as she had often reflected in St. Mary Mead, even the most genteel village held secrets capable of driving ordinary people to extraordinary acts. Thus, the peaceful December night, which had promised only celebration and warmth, was transformed. The FT continued with polite chatter, but Miss Marple's mind was already working through the puzzle. A single sip of poisoned mulled wine had turned a scene of festivity into one of suspicion, and every glance and gesture of the guests would henceforth hold meaning. Little Hemsby had become a quiet theatre of human motives, and Miss Marple, quietly knitting once more by the fire, was ready to observe it all. Morning broke over Little Hemsby with a pale winter sun, the frost sparkling across the manor gardens. Lady Agatha, now recovered enough to speak, recounted her terrifying experience to Miss Marple in careful, measured words. "It must have been deliberate, Miss Marple," she said, still trembling slightly. "I cannot imagine who would wish me harm." Miss Marple, ever patient and unassuming, merely nodded, sipping her tea. "People can be unexpectedly inventive, Lady Agatha. Sometimes it is the simplest motives that conceal the deepest resentments." Her words were gentle but precise, and Lady Agatha considered them thoughtfully. The first task was to examine the mulled wine itself. Dr. Hargrave agreed to bring a sample from the remaining punch, and Miss Marple observed closely as he noted the subtle almond-like scent of cyanide, a common method of poisoning in her experience. The revelation made the stakes clear. This had been no accident. The assailant had meant for harm, and had chosen a moment of communal trust to strike. Miss Marple began her inquiries with the household staff, beginning with Mrs. Pritchard. The housekeeper, brisk and immaculate, recounted the preparation of the mulled wine. She had boiled cloves and cinnamon, added orange zest, and sweetened it with sugar, all according to Lady Agatha's meticulous instructions. Only she, Lady Agatha, and Richard had access to the final serving. "I cannot imagine anyone wanting to harm her," Mrs. Pritchard insisted, though the sharp line of her mouth suggested she was concealing some irritation. Next, Miss Marple spoke with Richard Thornbury. He was eager to dismiss suspicion. "Aunt Agatha, I assure you I would never—" he began, only to pause as Miss Marple observed his hands fidgeting. She made a quiet mental note. Nervousness can be telling, but it is not proof. Caroline Devine, meanwhile, appeared composed, but Miss Marple noticed a faint stain on her glove. When questioned, Caroline claimed it was from a spilled berry tart, yet the timing seemed curious. Reverend Bellamy, the ever-polite cleric, mentioned he had been in the library when the wine was prepared, ostensibly to avoid the bustle, while Dr. Hargrave recounted his immediate attention to Lady Agatha, but declined to speculate on the culprit. Throughout her interviews, Miss Marple's mind worked as quietly and steadily as her knitting needles. She considered the motives: financial gain, jealousy, unrequited affection, or perhaps revenge. Each suspect revealed a fragment of human emotion: fear, greed, pride, but none admitted to any wrongdoing. And yet, the poison had been placed with deliberate care, suggesting both knowledge and access. Observing the manor itself, Miss Marple noted the arrangement of the kitchen, the locked cabinets, and the patterns of daily life. Small details caught her attention: the way Mrs. Pritchard always kept the keys on a chain around her neck, the fact that Richard had been unusually eager to assist with the decorations, and Caroline's habit of lingering near the wine table under the guise of social chat. Each small observation was filed away in her mind, like stitches in a complex tapestry. She also spoke with some of the village visitors, noting their impressions. "It's shocking," said Mrs. Cartwright, a local baker, "but I shouldn't be surprised. There's been talk of Lady Agatha's fortune." Miss Marple made no comment, but stored the remark for later consideration. Human nature was often the key, and rumours, however embellished, frequently contained kernels of truth. By the end of the morning, a subtle tension had settled over Thornbury Manor. Miss Marple, sitting once more in her chair by the fire, reflected on what she had observed. Poisoning required forethought and precision, yet the perpetrator had moved in a familiar setting, among familiar people. The question was not merely who could commit the crime, but who would, and why, and Miss Marple, with the quiet patience of her years and the careful attention to human behaviour, began to see patterns emerge in the smallest gestures, the faintest hesitations, and the casual remarks of those around her. The morning had given way to a quiet, snowy afternoon at Thornbury Manor, the snowflakes drifting lazily past the mullioned windows, softening the landscape outside. Inside, the manor was far from serene. Miss Marple had begun to notice subtle discrepancies in the accounts of the guests and staff, and the cosy tea atmosphere of the previous evening had given way to a tense undercurrent of suspicion. The poisoning had not been merely an impulsive act, it had required planning, and the perpetrator, Miss Marple suspected, had assumed that their actions would remain hidden among the distractions of the evening. The first twist emerged when Miss Marple revisited the kitchen. While speaking with Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper's meticulous story of the preparation of the mulled wine began to unravel in small but telling ways. I only went to fetch the cinnamon sticks from the pantry," Mrs. Pritchard stammered when asked about the spice jar locations. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes had noted earlier that the pantry door had a faint smudge near the handle, one that could not have come from someone wearing gloves. Perhaps it was nothing, Miss Marple mused inwardly, but sometimes nothing is the very thing that guides one toward truth. Meanwhile, a seemingly innocuous remark by Caroline Devine caught her attention. While helping Lady Agatha settle into her armchair, Caroline had mentioned, almost casually, that she had helped stir the mulled wine. The words were light, spoken with a practiced smile, but Miss Marple sensed a tension underneath, a tiny flicker of hesitation that betrayed either guilt or knowledge withheld. To verify, she retraced the steps of the wine's preparation, noting which guests had been near the punch at what times. Caroline's claim did not align with the others' accounts. Reverend Bellamy, whom Miss Marple had initially considered entirely above suspicion, revealed another puzzle. He had been observing the FFT from the library, ostensibly to avoid the crowd, yet when Miss Marple asked about his exact movements, his eyes flickered toward the manor's grand clock, then away, as if afraid of revealing something. The Reverend's hesitation was small, almost imperceptible, but it added another layer of complexity. Even the most outwardly gentle individuals could harbour secrets. Adding to the confusion, Dr. Hargrave presented a new piece of information. He had examined the wine carefully and discovered traces of a rare substance, a tincture often used in herbal remedies, which could mask the smell and taste of cyanide. It was not the simple poisoning Miss Marple had first considered. Whoever had used it had knowledge of chemistry or access to someone with it, narrowing the list of potential culprits to those who had both opportunity and subtle expertise. As she pieced together these fragments, Miss Marple encountered what would be the first of several red herrings. Mrs. Pritchard, in a moment of unguarded speech, implied that Richard had been unusually interested in his aunt's will. Caroline, noticing Miss Marple's attention, quickly contradicted her, suggesting that it was the housekeeper herself who had been disgruntled over a perceived slight years ago. Both accusations were plausible in isolation, yet each contradicted the other, creating a fog of uncertainty that Miss Marple navigated with careful thought rather than immediate judgment. The villagers themselves contributed additional distractions. Mrs. Cartwright, the baker, reported a whispered conversation she claimed to have overheard between Richard and Caroline, which hinted at financial disputes and secret engagements. Meanwhile, a gardener mentioned seeing a shadow near the wine table on the night of the FT, though he could not identify who it had been. Each fragment seemed relevant, yet none fit neatly with the pattern Miss Marple was beginning to discern. That evening, Miss Marple invited all the key players to the drawing room under the pretense of offering comfort to Lady Agatha. As the fire crackled, she listened with careful patience to each story, noting subtle contradictions, fleeting glances, and moments of nervous laughter. Richard's eagerness to reassure Lady Agatha seemed rehearsed, while Caroline's attention appeared at times overly focused on Lady Agatha rather than the conversation at hand. Mrs. Pritchard, ever watchful, made small but pointed remarks, seemingly to redirect suspicion. Reverend Bellamy's calm exterior masked an undercurrent of unease, and Dr. Hargrave, professional as ever, displayed a hint of curiosity more than concern. A sudden revelation came in the form of a letter, discovered tucked beneath the fireguard by Lady Agatha's cat, which had knocked it from the mantelpiece in its usual playful manner. The letter, written in a shaky hand, was unsigned but hinted at knowledge of Lady Agatha's recent business dealings, referencing debts and obligations unknown to the other guests. Miss Marple read it carefully, noting phrases that suggested familiarity with the household routines and the ability to move unnoticed. It was a clue, yes, but it also led the investigation into a labyrinth of possible suspects. Yet even as she weighed these new discoveries, Miss Marple knew that appearances were deceiving. People lie, not always to conceal guilt, but often to protect themselves or others. Every gesture, every misstatement had to be measured against known behavior, social patterns, and psychological subtleties. She reflected, as she often did, on the ways human nature repeated itself across generations and villages. People in Little Hemsby, despite their genteel farce aids, displayed the same petty envies, resentments, and ambitions she had seen countless times before in St. Mary Maid. Miss Marple's mind, calm yet relentless, began to weave a web of probabilities, testing each against the small, but telling details she had observed: the smudge on the pantry door, the inconsistency in Caroline's story, the subtle nervousness of Reverend Bellamy, and the knowledge implied by the unusual tincture. And as the mulled wine moon rose once more, casting silver light across Thornbury Manor, she realized that the puzzle was far from solved, but that the pieces were now slowly beginning to fit together, hinting at the identity of a cunning mind hiding behind a mask of civility. By the end of Act 2, the investigation had shifted from mere suspicion to a complex tapestry of motives, opportunities, and hidden resentments. The red herrings had multiplied, yet they had also helped Miss Marple narrow her focus, revealing the patterns that only a careful observer could detect. Somewhere among the guests lurked the truth, waiting for her to uncover it with the quiet but unerring precision that had solved many a mystery before. The night deepened over Little Hemsby, with a frost that glazed the manor gardens in sparkling ice and moonlight streaming through the tall windows of Thornbury Manor. Inside, the fire in the drawing room crackled softly, casting warm reflections upon the polished wooden floor. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner, knitting calmly, yet her mind was far from idle. The clues collected over the previous day, the poisoned mulled wine, the mysterious letter, the subtle behaviours of the guests, had begun to coalesce in her mind like threads being woven into a coherent tapestry. Miss Marple began by reviewing the evidence piece by piece, methodically. The poison used was rare and well concealed, a tincture capable of masking the taste and scent of cyanide. Whoever had used it had access to the kitchen and an intimate understanding of Lady Agatha's routines, as well as knowledge of chemistry or access to someone who did. This immediately ruled out the casual visitor or a merely opportunistic intruder. She considered the guests once more. Richard's anxiety over the inheritance and subtle defensiveness made him a plausible suspect, but the signs of his distress were ordinary for someone worried about a family member's sudden illness. Caroline's overstated attentiveness and her claim of helping stir the wine were suspicious, yet Miss Marple felt that her nervousness stemmed more from social etiquette and a desire to be helpful than from malice. Dr. Hargrave, while knowledgeable about poisons, had no opportunity to tamper with the wine unnoticed during the FT itself. Reverend Bellamy's hesitations were brief, and in her experience, more indicative of discomfort with confrontation than intent to harm. It was Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, who captured Miss Marple's attention most fully. Her meticulousness was admirable, but the faint smudge on the pantry door, the contradictions in her story, and her subtle redirection of suspicion suggested a familiarity with both the household and its secrets that none of the others possessed. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Pritchard's reaction when Lady Agatha mentioned recent changes to the will, a small flicker of anger that was quickly masked by polite civility. Subtle, but telling. The discovery of the letter tucked beneath the fireguard further clarified the picture, written by someone with detailed knowledge of Lady Agatha's finances and household routines. It hinted at grievances over property and position within the manor. Miss Marple pondered the phrasing, dead settled, but not forgotten. The handwriting was tremulous, suggesting either age or emotional agitation, but the content implied calculation rather than impulsive anger. Miss Marple spent hours in quiet observation, noting the smallest gestures of each suspect. Caroline's eyes often flickered to Mrs. Pritchard when discussing Lady Agatha, and Richard's hands were rarely still. Reverend Bellamy tended to adjust his clerical collar when uncomfortable, and Dr. Hargrave's attention was often focused on the technical aspects of the wine, rather than the human behaviour surrounding it. Each clue, each observation, was mentally filed away, awaiting the moment when the hidden truth would become visible. Then, one small yet crucial detail illuminated the entire mystery. Miss Marple recalled the placement of the wine glasses at the FT. Only those serving or handling the wine would have had sufficient opportunity to introduce the poison. She considered the movements of each person that evening, who approached the tray, who lingered near it, who had motive and means. Mrs. Pritchard's presence, ostensibly to serve, allowed her both proximity and control, and her knowledge of Lady Agatha's preferences meant that the poisoned sip would likely be taken first by the intended victim. Miss Marple also noted the behavioural patterns of Mrs. Pritchard during questioning. The housekeeper's insistence on directing attention away from herself, the tiny errors in her recollections, the almost imperceptible twitch of her fingers when discussing the wine, these were the silent confessions of a guilty conscience. And yet, Miss Marple's experience taught her that the most dangerous individuals are not those who act in haste, but those who act with careful deliberation, cloaking malice in civility. She reflected upon human nature, as she often did, and the quiet lessons of countless English villages. People commit crimes not merely out of greed, but out of resentment, jealousy, fear of change, or a perceived slight. Mrs. Pritchard had spent years devoted to the manor, yet subtle slights, changes to the will, decisions made without her counsel, had accumulated until the tension became unbearable. The poisoning had been a calculated act, meant to send a warning or achieve a goal without immediate suspicion falling upon her. Miss Marple, satisfied with the web of clues she had woven in her mind, decided that the confrontation must be carefully orchestrated. Accusation without evidence would achieve nothing. Subtle reasoning, revealing knowledge in a manner that left the guilty party with nowhere to hide, was far more effective. She arranged for all present, Lady Agatha, Richard Caroline, Reverend Bellamy, Dr. Hargrave, and Mrs. Pritchard, to gather in the drawing-room once more. The fire was bright, casting a warm glow, yet the air was charged with expectation. With her calm, measured voice, Miss Marple began to recount the sequence of events, each small observation leading inexorably to the truth. She spoke of the wine preparation, the unusual tincture, the moments of nervousness, and the discrepancies in statements. She described the letter and its implications, the patterns of behavior during the festive, and the subtle signs that revealed who had truly manipulated events. Her words were gentle yet unyielding, and as she spoke, the room grew still. And then, with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift, all the pieces fell into place. Mrs. Pritchard's composure faltered, the housekeeper's eyes widened, and her lips parted as if to speak, yet no words came. Miss Marple, as always, had relied not on drama, but on the patient observation of human nature. In this room, with the firelight dancing across faces, the truth shone clearly. The poison had been administered by the very person entrusted with the household's care, motivated by years of suppressed resentment and the hope of altering Lady Agatha's affairs to suit herself. The drawing-room of Thornbury Manor held a peculiar stillness that evening, a silence heavy with anticipation. The fire's glow illuminated the faces of the assembled company, each guest reflecting the tension of the previous days. Lady Agatha sat in her armchair, still recovering from the fright of the poisoned mulled wine, while Richard and Caroline exchanged nervous glances. Reverend Bellamy adjusted his collar and Dr. Hargrave remained composed, yet his eyes were sharp, keenly observant. And in the corner, Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, stood with an air of propriety that now seemed fragile, as if her very composure was on trial. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting resting on her lap, looked around the room with her customary calm. "We have spent a good deal of time examining the events of the FT," she began, her voice gentle, but carrying the authority of a mind that had seen countless human foibles. "And, naturally, everyone has been eager to ensure that Lady Agatha's well-being was protected." She paused, letting her words settle, watching closely for reactions. "As we know," she continued, "the mulled wine served at the FT contained a dangerous substance. This was not a matter of accident, but of intention. The question, therefore, is not merely how it happened, but who had both the opportunity and the motive to carry out such an act." Her gaze lingered briefly on Mrs. Pritchard. "We may consider those present, young Mr. Thornbury, Miss Devine, Reverend Bellamy, Dr. Hargrave, and our esteemed housekeeper. Each had reasons for concern, yet the careful observation of human nature, combined with the sequence of events, brings clarity." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly, a subtle signal that the net was closing. She recounted the small, telling details, the smudge on the pantry door, indicating ungloved hands, the minute inconsistencies in statements about who handled the wine, the unusual tincture used to mask the poison, and the letter, unsigned but pointing to intimate knowledge of Lady Agatha's household and financial affairs. Each piece of evidence, seemingly minor, contributed to a larger picture. "No," Miss Marple said, rising slowly. The act itself was deliberate, carried out by someone who moved confidently within the household, someone who was trusted to maintain the order of this manor, and yet held grievances that had festered quietly over the years. This person had not only knowledge, but the opportunity to manipulate events unseen by others. She turned her gaze fully upon Mrs. Pritchard. The housekeeper's face betrayed the faintest flicker of surprise, though her lips remained pressed firmly together. Miss Marple continued, "The poisoned mulled wine, the precise timing, the familiarity with Lady Agatha's habits, all point to you, Mrs. Pritchard. The motive is not merely malice, but a combination of resentment and fear. Resentment at years of service without recognition, and fear over changes in the household and the new arrangements Lady Agatha had begun to make, including the will." Mrs. Pritchard's hands trembled slightly, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of speaking, yet she remained silent. Miss Marple's voice softened. "It is often human nature to act rashly when one feels slighted, yet even the most careful plans are betrayed by the smallest gestures. The smudge on the pantry door, the hesitation when questioned about assisting with the wine, the subtle misdirections, all these revealed the truth." There was a pause in the room, and then, quietly, Mrs. Pritchard's shoulders slumped. "Yes, it was meant only as a warning," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I did not intend to harm her truly, only to make her notice that the years of service I gave were not forgotten." Her eyes brimmed with tears, reflecting both remorse and the weight of guilt. Lady Agatha, recovering her composure, spoke gently. "Mrs. Pritchard, it is shocking, but I am grateful that no real harm has come to me. Let us ensure that justice is served with understanding and care." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. The resolution was not only about unveiling the truth, but restoring harmony to a household unsettled by fear and resentment. Richard, visibly relieved, approached his aunt. "I had feared for the worst, Aunt Agatha. I am glad it is over," he said, gratitude in his tone. Caroline, too, smiled, relieved that the tension had been resolved without scandal. Reverend Bellamy quietly expressed his readiness to provide guidance, while Dr. Hargrave confirmed the minor precautions needed to ensure Lady Agatha's continued health. Miss Marple, returning to her chair and resuming her knitting, reflected on the intricacies of human behaviour. "It is remarkable," she mused aloud, "or even the smallest grievances, when nurtured over years, can lead to acts that seem beyond ordinary understanding. And yet, with careful observation and patience, even these hidden currents reveal themselves." The household, now restored to a semblance of calm, prepared for a quieter continuation of the holiday festivities. The frost-covered gardens, the softly falling snow, and the gentle glow of the mulled wine moon outside reminded them all of the warmth and community of the village, even in the face of human frailty. Lady Agatha, surrounded by friends and family, expressed her renewed gratitude for the care and insight that had prevented tragedy. Miss Marple, as always, remained a quiet observer, content in the knowledge that justice had been served and harmony restored. She had witnessed the full spectrum of human nature: kindness and cruelty, fear and courage, subtle deception and honesty. And as the firelight flickered across the drawing room and the snow continued to blanket little Hemsby in silver, she contemplated the enduring truth of the villages she knew so well, that even in the most genteel settings, secrets linger, but careful attention, patience, and understanding can reveal them in time. The mulled wine moon shone down on Thornbury Manor, a silent witness to the unravelling of a carefully concealed plot. The mystery had been solved, the guilty acknowledged, and the village could once again embrace the warmth and camaraderie of the holiday season. Miss Marple, knitting calmly by the fire, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Another puzzle, intricate and human, had been quietly and definitively resolved.